Our first speaker today is Brenda Wahler. And Brenda was born in Great Falls and first rode a horse on her father's ranch near Virgil, Montana, which I did look up. I just don't know how to pronounce it. It's northeast of here, so point to the northeast and that's where it's at.
Sandy and all that slangy. Everybody knows what that is, or kind of, sandy a little bit.
We've probably all heard of Big Sandy based on the current political ads. Today Brenda is a Helena attorney, author, and historian. Her book, Montana Horse Racing, A History, was published in 2019. And in 2023, she published part one of a Marcus Daly biography titled Marcus Daly's Road to Montana. And she's now finishing up part two of her Daly biography, focusing on how the Copper King became, quote, Prince of the American Turf and Mining King of the World, unquote. So please welcome Brenda.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to make sure everybody is coming out of their lunch coma. So. And at this time, the horses are on the track. So to start out a talk about the horse racing in north central Montana, what we have to do is begin with the dawn of time. And I'm going to make that part really, really short because it really don't want to be going till the dawn of time is over. But basically, horse racing in Montana began with horses. And there's some debate over when exactly horses arrived in Montana, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say they probably got here at least 50 to 100 years before white men admitted that they were here. So they've been around for several hundred years. And traditional historic native match races look something like this 1901 Huffman photo, which shows some races down by Lame Deer. But you see this dust in the background, and this is the horses coming on the race. And the large number of people here is the finish line. Just making sure the mic is okay. Can you hear me in the back all right? Okay. So we had early races. We probably had races between Native people and explorers, soldiers, and fur trappers. Probably in the 1850s, around the time we hear stories that some of the early fur traders, Alexander Culbertson, his wife, Naduista Xena, they were running horses and having match races all along the high line from what is now Fort Union to what is now Fort Benton. And we definitely have documentation that Johnny Grant was running racehorses up at organized events in Fort Benton around 1861. So we've got horse racing up in this part of the state going back before Montana Territory was Montana Territory. The first official meet where you had horses run in a circle on an oval track. They've been doing that for a little while, but Helena organized the first territorial fair in 1868, so they get the first official horse racing meet. And it took Great Falls a lot longer to get it together, but City of Great Falls, as we all learned this morning, the plat was filed in 1884. And I always love it because these early histories of Great Falls, people like to say, oh, the hard-working pioneers were too busy to engage in frivolous things like horse racing. And I'm like, they were racing on the 4th of July a year later. So there. Best of all, the first race meet on the 4th of July, the hottest race on the program was the children's pony race. The horse that won was the unfortunately named and deceptively named pony named Sleepy Dick. And we're just not going to go much farther up the number of horses with names like that. Second place was a girl who, her and her pony, she raced sights up on a pony. And I'm like, wow, and came in second. So that was Great Falls on 4th of July, 1885. Now, Montana really got on the map fairly soon on the national scene, and there's a lot of work that's been done on various famous people in Montana and their horses that went to Eastern tracks and did well. But the two big ones were Spokane, who won the Kentucky Derby in 1889. And he was owned by a silver magnate named Noah Armstrong, who had the Hecla smelter down by Glendale, Montana. Later got involved with railroads, Great Northern and some others. Named the horse Spokane because he was in Spokane Falls, Washington Territory, when he got word that his prize mare had foaled this fine racehorse in Montana. So the other famous horse that won one of our big classic Triple Crown races was another horse foaled in Montana, raised in Montana, and only goes elsewhere when he's old enough for race training, and that was Scottish Chieftain, who won the 1897 Belmont Stakes. And that was Marcus Daly's horse. It's kind of amusing because Daly entered two horses. The other one was his expensive colt imported from England, who came in dead last. Bless his heart, although he's a good horse, it was a bad day. But this is the trophy that Scottish Chieftain won in 1897 Belmont. It was sitting on an antique table in the 80s at the estate sale. Sold to some people. I do have their names. I think they have both since passed away. It's probably somewhere in either Seattle or Spokane, and they think it's a bronze. It is sterling silver. It was sculpted by Paulding Farnham of Tiffany's. And if anybody has any idea where it is, please let me know and let Tiffany's know, because they'd love to find out also. There's a whole story behind that trophy that one of Daly's other horses won it, and it's a completely made up story. It's not true. This was Scottish Chieftain's Belmont trophy. So putting out a history mystery to everybody, and I would love to have somebody solve it someday. Moving on to the 21st century, there was a horse that was foaled technically in Kentucky, because there are breeding incentives for where a horse is foaled that make you able to have a horse win more money in certain horse races. And so you, even if you've got a mare who's a month short of dropping a foal, you can put her on a trailer and haul her to Kentucky so she drops it in Kentucky. But this fellow was owned and bred by Al and Joyce Bell of Great Falls, Montana. They are standing with his mama. Her name was Cappuccino Bay. She lived to be 30 years old and just died right here in Cascade County just a few years ago in 2019. And her 1999 baby was Medallion d'Or. Now, horse racing fans wake up when they hear that name, because he has now sired over 56 horses that have sold for more than $1 million at the various racehorse sales through this year. He is still alive. He is still producing foals. He is the only horse who lived in Montana. And what happened is, after he was born in Kentucky, it's a little expensive to keep a horse out there. So Al and Joyce hauled him and his mama back to Cascade County, and he grew up on the Montana Bunchgrass. So even though he wasn't foaled here and he didn't spend a lot of his life here, he spent his formative years. And so he had the Montana Bunchgrass in his bones when he ran all three of the Triple Crown races. And he was the only Montana affiliated horse that's ever lived here for a while who has run all three of those races. He had kind of a rough year. His best run was second in the Belmont, where he got beat right at the wire by this unknown long shot. Those who care, his name was Sarada. We're all going, the heck is that? But he kind of redeemed himself, because one of his most famous babies was a little filly named Rachel Alexandra, and she won the Preakness in 2009. So that's our Montana connection to all three Triple Crown races. But let's go back to Great Falls. Our first major horse breeder was none other than Robert Vaughn, who Vaughn, Montana, Sun River, first homestead claim, at least in this part of what was then called Choteau County. By 1879, he was already known as somebody who bred racehorses. In 1885, he sold off a lot of his harness trotting horse racers in favor of what they called the runners. And I want to tell everybody, if you're ever doing horse stuff, remember there's a difference between a thoroughbred with the capital T and thoroughbred with a little t. The word thoroughbred with a little t means a purebred animal. So you'll hear things like thoroughbred shorthorn cattle, and you're like, wait a second, that sounds like a really weird hybrid. But the thoroughbred horse, when horse people say a thoroughbred, we're talking about the running race horses with specific bloodlines that are registered with the jockey club. And so you have to be very, very careful, because people will say this horse was a thoroughbred. Doesn't mean it was a racehorse. You hear things about, a thoroughbred Norman. Well, that wasn't a crossbred between a thoroughbred and a draft horse. That was a purebred draft horse. And so in all of the research, and whether you capitalize or use lowercase is also kind of ambivalent, but just be very, very aware that in historic research, just because somebody calls a horse a thoroughbred doesn't mean it was a big T thoroughbred. But by 1885, Vaughn had over 1,000 horses. And so he did have to thin the herd a little, and he definitely sold off all his part-bred stock to focus on purebred animals, and was the foremost horseman of northern Montana. 1889, those of you who know his story, his wife, his beloved young wife, died, leaving him and his one-year-old daughter, Arvonia. Moved to town, built a hotel we now know as the Hotel Arvon, and of course, Arvon, get it? That's where everything, the Arvon thing, comes from. So that's our Celtic cowboy and a major contributor to early Montana horse racing. He sold his ranch to Thomas Couch. Some people called him Captain Couch. Captain was not a military title. He was actually born in Cornwall. He became a mining superintendent in Butte. And just like you sometimes, any Mary Poppins fans of Dick Van Dyke and bad Cockney accents would say governor, just like some people might have had that title. Captain was what the other miners from Cornwall would call Mr. Couch, a captain. So he bought Vaughn's ranch, his livestock, his horses. He didn't really get into the breeding, and he's not particularly notable in horse racing, but he did start up around the Smelter in Great Falls, the Boston and Montana. They had a band. He brought up the band from Butte to play at the horse races in 1891. And I'm going to make a pitch for the Boston and Montana barn, which was built in 1901. And I just saw, if you find Ken Robinson running around here, he's with a group of people. They are trying to save that barn. It's in very bad shape. It needs a lot of money. Somebody wants to write a check. I'm all for saving these big old historic barns. I think they're very cool. And so Mr. Couch got a slide because you need to save the Boston and Montana barn. Now, third player, Mr. Paris Gibson, founder of Great Falls. In 1889, the North Montana Fair Association formed. Mr. Gibson, several other names, Mr. Robert Vaughn. And the idea was, in those days, if you hear people talking about a fair, what they're really talking about is horse racing. Because the first thing they were going to do is go out and grade a track. A couple of newspaper clippings that the slide erased. That's anyway, I've got a glitch. These little clippings that were up here that seem to have vanished from the PowerPoint. They commissioned somebody to survey an appropriate location and to grade a 1-mile track. This is a painting at the History Museum. And if you look at Great Falls, you go this way, down this road, you're going to see this. This is the first racetrack in Great Falls. They called it the West Side Track. It is near an area we call Watson Coulee. This at lunch, Chris Latre was talking about Hill 57. It's not that far from Hill 57. There may have been a little rail stop out there called Watson way back, so I suspect its location had something to do with train tracks because there weren't horse trailers in those days. And so if you wanted to bring in race horses, they came in on box cars and you didn't want them to have to go too far to get to the track. That track, do you see what I see? Look very carefully at the open space. That track's footprint still exists. This was Google Earth, a 2023 aerial shot. So we know the Watson Cooley track is still there. I think it's cool. I'm a junkie for flying around looking for ovals. I fly around the New all the time. Found the train track at the Doncaster Round Barn as well. It's great. So just to give you some perspective, that track is obviously way west of town. Here's today's Expo Park. And if you're ever wondering what the difference is between a 1 mile oval and a half-mile oval, this is a half-mile oval. Infield's about 12, 13 acres. This is a 1 mile oval. And notice it's kind of an exponentially bigger thing. Inside of that oval is about 40 acres. And so if you're ever wondering how big a track was, that's a good way to compare them. And why a 1 mile oval? 1 mile was for the harness horses. They're measured on what they call the standard mile, how fast they could trot to qualify to be reported in what later became the standard bred registry. And if you're driving a cart, think about your little motorcycles or whatever else you may have. If you're driving a cart around a half mile oval, these are tight turns, and you're going to go wee on one wheel. Not good with horses. The 1 mile was a little safer. Now, second track was Black Eagle Park, and it was built in 1898, ran until 1910. I cannot find any pictures of that track or the horses on it. If anybody finds one, let me know. But this is what the park itself looked like. City of Great Falls bought it, discontinued racing. But in the interim period, it had a lot of very fun meets. It was kind of a big deal to first decade of the 20th century. Was a lot of horse racing. They talk about that the American Trotter trip to Black Eagle Park is a pleasurable surprise. Port Assiniboine up by Havre, they began the very first example of a military show put on during the fair in 1904 when they did their annual march. 3rd Cavalry plus several platoons of infantry marched down from Havre in full gear, set up an encampment on the edge of the grounds, did all sorts of exhibitions of trick riding and military things, and had a lot of fun. People came in droves. And after the city bought the park, it kind of was turned over to baseball and racing. What was left went back to the old West Side location. Now, here's where that one was. There's Centene Stadium. What would fit on the golf course? A mile oval, easily. You wouldn't want it to cross the railroad tracks because tracks were there. But again, here come the trains, stop, take off the horses, go on to your thing. I love to draw circles on maps. The Montana legislature banned gambling in 1915. I could talk endlessly about the drama surrounding that, but in a word, Butte had something to do with it. In 1926, some guys in Helena came up with a little shenanigan to break the law on purpose to go to the Supreme Court. And the Montana Supreme Court in 1926 said that a certain type of betting using co-ownership pools amongst bettors betting mutually amongst themselves was legal. That is, we call that pari-mutuel betting. And so Great Falls starts thinking, let's bring back some horses. And they begin to take over a little livestock exhibition area just across the river, begins planning a whole new fairgrounds. They run a little slow. In 1929, there were 37 county fairs. They all had horse racing, almost all of them. And if anybody saw Cody's talk this morning, yes, the North Montana Fair revitalized in 1941 or 31. And by the way, they did change the name for the North Montana Fair to the North Montana State Fair. And in 1939, the word North got dropped off. I think there was legislative designation that Great Falls was the official state fair because there had been a state fair in Helena and it had died off. So that's my guess. Just a wonderful, quick headline from the first day of the revitalized fair in 1931. And 15 years later, the greatest disaster that ever hit anywhere in Montana horse racing was again the military. They had an air base, an Army air base out there, and they were going to shoot the works and do the air show. They had 3 bombers come flying over the fairgrounds in formation. The wing of one plane clipped the tail of another. Right here is a chunk of the tail section that fell on the track. That plane plowed into these barns, through them, killed 19 horses, both pilots, 3 other people on the ground. The second plane that had the wing that had clipped it, they go limping off and crash somewhere out by the Ayrshire Dairy, killing both of those pilots. And the third plane, those guys managed to veer off back to the base, landed alive, and walked away from a crash landing. So, and again, anybody that knows Ken, ask Ken about the airplane crash. He was there when he was a little boy. He can tell you about it firsthand. It's quite a story. Racing continued to expand a great deal. And by the time we passed the 1972 Constitution, it allows gambling when allowed by legislation or by a voter referenda. The legislature immediately approved pari-mutuel betting, which launched what we call Montana's second golden age of horse racing. And it was huge. It was the only kind of gambling allowed in Montana. We had, in 1982, was the one peak where we had 14 different tracks running meets. The other peak was in 1984. We didn't have quite as many tracks running, but we had more days. We had 143 race days. And when we think about Montana weather, that was pushing like April through September into early October, and wagering handle over $11 million. This is a Great Falls State Fair race meet ad from the paper. The print is small, but 29 days of racing, over $400,000 in purses. And they show, several weekends in June, several weekends in May, several weekends in July, and the first 3 days of August. And so racing in Great Falls was huge. And then just a great picture from 1987 of the betting windows. Actually, I've seen the betting windows this last summer were more packed and crowded than that, but they might have had more windows. At any rate, what changed was legalizing video poker, and all the gaming kind of meant it moved from the tracks to the bars, and racing really went into a lot of struggles, a lot of problems. Great Falls is now one of the only 2 cities with licensed meets. But Great Falls has run horses every single year since 1931, with the exception of those 4 years. Of course, 2020 was COVID. And so we've got some hope that we keep racing alive in Great Falls. And when I was up there in 2018 working on my book, one of the things I noticed was how powerful the native influence still is. We talked about the match races way back. The Bird Rattler family are major players. I'd like you guys to listen to this. That is Earl Old person honoring Joe Bird Rattler. And I apologize, I cut off the way it cut off. But one of the things that I want to have folks be aware of is that both Joe and Earl Oldperson have now passed away. They are no longer with us. And it's really quite a poignant thing to that I was able to catch them with this. The race in question was the Joe Bird Rattler Special. The family had sponsored the race, the blanket, the trophy, and they had the honoring ceremony right before they ran the horses. And so horses continue to be very important to not just Montana, but to Native people in Montana. I love to take identical shots of historic images. 1946 was the year of a big plane crash, and there's a race wrapping up. And I was able to get almost exactly the same angle in 2018. Horses still coming down the home stretch. I think that it's a very rich heritage. It's a heritage both predating white settlement. It's there are two other race meets besides Great Falls and Miles City running. One of them is at Browning during North American Indian Days, and the other is at Pro Fair. And they both have starting gates, jockeys with numbers, timers, the whole bit. There's actually now officially there's two meets, but in reality we have four. And if you want to have more about Montana horse racing, I have a book. It is for sale over with the stuff at the little gift shop, the little vendor area. You'll find it there. And if anybody's wandering around with a copy and you want me to sign it, I will just find me and I will do that. And so without any further ado, I will close my talk and turn it over. And thank you so much.